Welcome back to Grade 8 History, Unit Number 2, Canada's Changing Society, 1890 to 1914. This is Lesson Number 16. How did cultural diversity impact Canada? Before we begin today's lesson, let's consider the following. How do you think people already living in Canada felt about new cultures being introduced through immigration? And of course, I'm referring to the time period late 1800s and early 1900s. So please do keep that in mind as you put the video on pause and you consider the question I just read and when you write your response to this question. Please put the video on pause now. All right, let's get started. Confederation may have united Canada politically, but socially, Canada was a very fragmented country. The original inhabitants, the First Nations and Inuit people, along with French and English colonists, the Metis, and immigrants from different parts of the world were spread across Canada's massive area. But ideas on how to unify these groups of people led to further conflict and division. Immigrants brought new languages and traditions that were very different from the cultures already present in Canada. Some immigrants chose to settle in areas where other members of their culture lived. During the late 1890s and early 1900s, Jewish people were relative newcomers to Canada and the city of Toronto. Take a look at this picture from the time period and notice the sign in the restaurant window. What do you notice about this sign in the restaurant window? And how do you think English Torontonians reacted to seeing this sign? Please put the video on pause so that you can write down your response to these two questions. And let's go on. Many English Canadians believed that ethnic diversity was a threat to the unity of Canada. J.S. Wordsworth was a Protestant minister and missionary who later became a member of Parliament. As a missionary, Wordsworth helped the poor in Winnipeg and Toronto. He wrote about the important contributions made by immigrants, and he spoke publicly about the Christian duty to help immigrants. However, Wordsworth also stated that in order to make Canada a united country, the immigrants had to be, quote unquote, transformed into Canadians. What he meant was that he wanted to see them assimilated. Tensions increased when settlers moved into areas that used to have a French majority. For example, Manitoba was at one time mainly French Catholic. This changed by the 1890s as only 15% were French Catholic. While the Manitoba Act and the British North America Act had guaranteed French and Catholic education rights, the Official Language Act of 1890 made English the only official language in Manitoba. French and Catholic leaders in and outside of Manitoba were outraged and demanded that the federal government undo the provincial law. Of course, the Official Language Act also threatened the rights of the Métis, many of whom were French-speaking and Catholic. In 1895, a high court in Britain ruled that the federal government could strike down provincial laws, including the Manitoba government's decision to cut funding for French and Catholic education. The ruling put the federal government in a difficult position. Conservative Prime Minister Mackenzie Bowell supported French Catholic rights in Manitoba, but his government was divided on what to do. In 1896, the Conservatives lost the federal election over their handling of what was being called the Manitoba Schools Question. And here we have a political cartoon that shows Conservative Prime Minister Bowell struggling with the Manitoba Schools Question. You'll notice here that there are cracks in the ice. And my question for you is, what do you think these cracks represent? Please put the video on pause so that you can consider and then write down your response to this question. Okay, let's continue. The Liberal Party won the election. The new Prime Minister, Wilfrid Laurier, was now tasked with finding a way to solve the problem and close the divide between the provinces and the federal government, the English and French, and Protestants and Catholics. Laurier's solution was to strike a compromise with Laurier-Greenway, the Premier of Manitoba. The Laurier-Greenway compromise worked like this. Religious education would be provided during the last half hour of the school day. A member of the Catholic or Protestant faith would provide this religious instruction to those who were of his faith. In schools where there were French-speaking or non-English-speaking students, a bilingual teacher would be in the classroom, with the end goal being to teach these students how to speak English. In 1892, the Northwest Territories passed legislation to remove French as an official language. The law also ended government funding for French education after grade 3. In 1905, the provinces of Alberta and Saskatchewan were created from the lower part of the Northwest Territories. These new provinces wanted to continue the same language policy. In order to satisfy the provinces and their French minority populations, Laurier made another compromise. He gave minorities the right to maintain separate schools. However, teachers had to teach the provincial curriculum. And the children you see in this picture are Ukrainian, and they're holding the British flag. So my question for you is, what is the significance of these Ukrainian children holding the British flag? Please put the video on pause so that you can write down your response to this question. And moving forward. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, many Francophones left Quebec in search of land to farm and other work opportunities. By 1910, 10% of Ontario's population was French-Canadian, and the Association for French-Canadian Education was established in the province. By 1911, Francophones represented almost 25% of Ottawa's population alone. This led to some Anglo-Ontarians fearing a French Catholic takeover. In 1912, the Ontario government introduced Regulation 17. This law limited French language instruction to grades 1 and 2. The new law angered French Ontarians who challenged the law in the courts and fought publicly for their rights. Over time, the Franco-Ontarian culture grew, and an official Franco-Ontarian flag was created. In 2016, the Ontario government formally apologized to Franco-Ontarians for Regulation 17. In this photo, these girls are celebrating Franco-Ontario Day in 2013. And I want you to take a closer look at this flag, and you're going to write down your response to this question. How does the Franco-Ontarian flag symbolize identity and unity? Please put the video on pause now. And let's continue. Quebec politician Henri Bourassa was a member of Laurier's government at the time of the Manitoba Schools Question. He had hoped to use his position to help defend French and Catholic education. However, he saw the Laurier-Greenway Compromise as a betrayal of French Catholic rights. He left politics in 1907 to become a Quebec provincial politician and journalist. He would become a very strong critic and opponent of Laurier and the federal government. And I'm just going to read the statement from Monsieur Bourassa. He said, "There is Ontario patriotism, Quebec patriotism, or Western patriotism, each based on the hope that it may swallow up the others, but there is no Canadian patriotism, and we can have no Canadian nation when we have no Canadian patriotism." My question for you is, how do you feel about Henri Bourassa's statement about Canadian patriotism? Do you agree with his view that there is no Canadian patriotism? It's time for you to put the video on pause so that you can consider Mr. Bourassa's statement and write down your response. All right, and time to wrap things up. So let's finish off today's video by considering these three questions which we will discuss in tomorrow's class. Question 1. Why did some English Canadians oppose language rights for French Canadian immigrants? 2. How did the Laurier-Greenway Compromise change the status of the French culture in Canada? And 3. What impact did the Laurier-Greenway Compromise have on some immigrant communities? As always, you're going to put the video on pause so that you can write down your responses to these three questions. If you don't feel confident in your ability to answer any or all of these questions, it means you need to go back and watch this video at least one more time. And then when you're ready, put the video on pause. All right, we have a lot of great questions to discuss in tomorrow's class. But until then, this concludes today's video.